let's talk about some movies. I'm Ryan Bueller, and welcome to episode 6 of the Beginner's Guide to Filmmaker podcast, where each month I pick a particular director, watch their entire filmography, then I create a crash course giving you an idea of who they are as a person, what kind of movies they make, and what to expect when watching one of their films. Then, later on, I record a movie talk discussing my thoughts on all of their films. So today, I'm going to be talking about M. Night Shyamalan. He's a very interesting director. One who has a lot of haters and a lot of fans. I almost guarantee everyone here has heard of M. Night Shyamalan before and has probably seen some of his films, whether it's The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, or the atrocity that is The Last Airbender. He's a man over the course of 3 decades who's written and directed 15 films, including his new film Knock at the Cabin coming out this February, which is the reason why I decided to sit down and do this podcast today. He has also written Devil from 2010 and Stuart Little from 1999. Yeah, the film where Michael J. Fox plays a CGI mouse. It kind of blew me away because I had seen that movie quite a bit when I was a kid, and now I know it was written by M. Night Shyamalan, the legend himself. He has also worked on a few shows, including the Apple TV Plus series Servant, which just came back for its 4th season, and Wayward Pines. He's also done a music video for Andra Day's songs Rise Up, which it's a really good song, and the music video is really good. He has directed films that have won awards, have been big box office successes, and films that a lot of people hated. I see this as being human. Personally, some of his films I consider to be some of my favorite films of all time, some films that I found decent, and then some films I've hated. So it kind of adds something when checking out one of his films for the first time. You never really know what you're going to get. So to start off with, who is M. Night Shyamalan? Well, Manoj Shyamalan was born August 6, 1970 in India. His family moved to the United States when he was a boy. He grew up and still lives in Philadelphia. His parents picked to live there because to them it embodied the American dream. He says he grew up in the suburbs outside Philly, which allowed him to live out a Steven Spielberg movie, riding bikes and hanging out with the neighborhood kids. Shyamalan decided to abbreviate his name to M because people had a hard time pronouncing his name in school. Eventually, it would become M. Night, which I think is a really unique name. It stands out in a crowd, and it just seems really cool. Like most directors who grew up in the 80s, M. Night had a Super 8 camera and filmed movies all the time. By the age of 17, he had created 45 films. He explains that he was able to make movie after movie because every time it didn't work out, he would just try again. His mistakes never defeated him because to him, it was just a hobby. Being a part of an immigrant family from India and having all other members of his family being doctors, M. Night was expected to also be a doctor. M. Night said telling his parents he wanted to be a director would have come with the same reaction if he had told them he wanted to be in a punk rock band. So, making movies for him was just a hobby on his way to med school. He grew up watching E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Star Wars, and they meant so much to him. So during his early films, he wanted to recreate that feeling. At first, he would recreate those movies he loved, not really making anything original. It was more of pretending to make a James Bond film instead of just making one of his own. He said, "I skipped the wonderful part of it, which is the creating." Eventually, he would realize that he would need to find his own voice to become a director, and that is a very big reason why M. Night became successful. He believes that everyone's individuality is their power. Because he was an Indian immigrant who grew up in Philadelphia, it gave him a unique voice that the industry didn't hear from, being able to tell new stories and bringing new perspectives to film. That is why he thinks people connect with his films all around the world. At a lecture, a Mexican student talked about not having enough Mexican voices in the film industry, and I love M. Night's response to this. He just exclaimed, "I need you," and "start telling stories." He went on to talk about how don't just be mad that you aren't at the table, bring up a chair, make the table longer. That, he says, is our responsibility. I love that. M. Night was successful because of his individuality and how unique his voice was. When everyone was going off to California to work in Hollywood, M. Night decided to stay in Philadelphia. He centers and films almost all of his films in Philly. Sometimes Philly is just spoken of just to let you know it's an M. Night film. This was different for the time, and it worked like a charm. Philly was a big part of him, and he stuck to what he knew. M. Night is at his best when he is writing films from his own voice. He would direct 2 films that didn't really make a splash, but in 1999 he would direct The Sixth Sense and become a household name and kickstart his career as an acclaimed director. Unfortunately, he would have a tough time living up to the success of The Sixth Sense. His career would go up, then down, then back up again with success. One of the most impressive aspects of M. Night for me is how he has failed many times but has never given up. His first 2 films were failures and critics tore them apart. He could have given up right there and then, but he didn't. He then went out and made The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, and Signs, 3 really, really good movies. Then some years later, he would make a few movies that failed and put him on the worst directors list. That didn't stop him either. He then regrouped and came back and made The Visit and Split, and they were both very successful. So he is living proof that no matter the setbacks, no matter the failures, you can always bounce back. Not everything you make is going to be the best, but the fact you keep trying, eventually you find something that works. Another aspect of M. Night that makes me respect him so much is the risks he takes. He spent millions of his own money to fund many of his films, The Visit, Split, Glass, Old, and even The Show Servant. He said, "The reason that I do it is to do it at the smallest number where I can be free. And I could do something provocative and different and unusual, and I'm not putting my partners at risk. I'm taking the risks." That's very bold, and there aren't many big-name directors who will do that, put that much on the line to make a movie. But it keeps from producers holding it back on his creativity. Even if it doesn't work, it's his movie, and that's how it should be. That is why I think his resurgence back in 2015 has led him to make a great comeback because of how he is focused on telling stories he wants to tell. He was able to come back with The Visit because of a 1,000-piece puzzle he was working on with his daughter. He came to realize that you don't need to know all the pieces and how they're going to fit together. You just need to focus on one piece at a time. That's what he did with The Visit. After a very early screening of the film that didn't land with its audience, he would edit one scene at a time until it became one of his most successful films he's ever made. So even if he comes out with a bad movie, as long as he's making movies like this, I'll go and support him. Honestly, I hope he keeps doing this and doesn't fall back to his dark ages, because watching some of those movies, I don't think I could do it again. What kind of movies does M. Night make, and what should you expect when watching one of his films? That's a very good question. M. Night almost always makes thrillers, some more thrilling than others. He's delved into romance, horror, and science fiction. He's not just a one-track mind when it comes to genres. There are certain elements that seem to be in almost every M. Night Shyamalan film, whether it's the way he handles colors, or the particular actors or characters he writes, the scale of his stories, but the main thing you can often expect is a twist. Which is kind of what he's come to be known for, his twist endings. He has created some of the best twist endings I've ever seen, he's made a few that didn't quite hit the mark, and he's made some films that didn't have a twist at all, which is rare, but it happens, and it's fine. He explains that plot twists shouldn't be the main goal of a film. It should be created organically while writing the story. He said that the Sixth Sense twist didn't come to him until he was already writing it. It was never originally intended to end the way that it did, which is pretty crazy to think about. M. Night says, "I love characters realizing things, and so if I'm doing my job right as a storyteller, you are with that character as they realize this thing that happens. I really enjoy it. I enjoy feeling emotions and intellectual thoughts that are unexpected." Writing movies with twists comes right from M. Night's personality. He loves playing tricks on people and making them laugh. That carried over into his writing. He loves playing tricks on his audience, making them laugh, making them ooh and ah, and it makes him truly happy when they can't believe what they just watched. He tends to have a very particular color scheme, using a limited number of colors in each of his films, having a good subtle look in certain films and then pretty obvious in other films, like the greens, blues, and purples in Unbreakable, or the reds and the yellows in The Village. He also usually casts an A-list celebrity to star in his movies, especially the lead role in his early films, like Mel Gibson in Signs, or Bruce Willis in Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and then later on Will Smith and Mark Wahlberg. However, that's something that he would kind of move away from later on. The format of his stories aren't always the same, but he usually has a small group of characters in very few locations, which I think is when M. Night is at his best. It focuses way more on the characters and the story itself, which betters the whole experience. Whenever he goes on a larger scale, he tends to lose his magic, his originality, and his voice. With the small-scale stories, he often has a single middle-aged man play the main character, some variations, but it's pretty consistent for his first 6 films. The main character will give a very subtle performance and is often aided by a child. The performance, I think, still works and doesn't ruin the experience. They just seem emotionless at times, but emotion comes out when it needs to. The performance is subtle cues through visual actions. The Sixth Sense is the perfect example. M. Night purposely limited Bruce Willis's character's dialogue, leaving the audience to see how the look in his eye changes as the story unfolds. In 2010 and 2013, M. Night tried to switch up on his formula due to some films that were not successful. But it just made it so much worse. But he found his way back to his small-scale stories with The Visit, with some updates. Water is something else that consistently pops up in his films. M. Night said, "Water always has a kind of special place for me in my movies. There's kind of a sense of purity from it or rebirth. It's often used that way in religious ceremonies." This appears in many of his films, many involving spoilers, which I won't bring up now. Like M. Night, who won't reveal the twist to his movies, even if it's been decades, I think that's really cool that he still wants you to be able to experience it, even if it's been 20 years. So I'm not going to spoil anything right here. Another thing to expect are M. Night cameos in almost every one of his films. He can either be off-screen, have a few lines, be a side character, or even be the main character like in Praying with Anger. He doesn't appear in Wide Awake, After Earth, and The Visit. I don't know why he isn't in Wide Awake, but he wanted to separate his name and reputation with After Earth and The Visit due to his previous failures. He didn't think anyone would want to watch a movie knowing he was part of it, which sounds really depressing and it makes me sad to think about, but looking back at that time frame, it does make sense that he would want to do that, which it's a shame, but it's true. Which kind of brings me to something else you should know when it comes to M. Night films. You should almost never watch the trailer. His films have suffered quite a bit in the past because of mismarketing. The Village suffered the most from mismarketing. I think you'd have the best experience going blind for most of these films. The Village was marketed as a horror film, and it's not really a horror movie. It has horror elements, but it's more of the romance story. It's more of a drama. And with Split, I actually had this experience. The trailer made it out to be this Blumhouse horror film, so I was expecting this horror movie, but Split is a lot more than that. It's more of a character drama, character study, psychological, and so when I watched it the first time, I was kind of let down and disappointed, but every time I've seen it since then, I have enjoyed it more and more, and I absolutely love it. I think it's definitely one of his best films, so definitely do not watch the trailers. Your best experience is watching the movie with as little knowledge as possible. An important part of M. Night is his voice and how his stories reflect who he is and where he came from. Many components of his films come from his upbringing and his background. Religion played a big role in his life. He went to Catholic school for 10 years and was around his family practicing their religious beliefs from India. This resulted in religion playing a big part in his films. No matter what the movie is about, comic books, aliens, or ghosts, he sees it as just the clothing for a discussion about the crisis of faith. He also writes his characters to give him a way to deal with what he believes in. David Dunn in Unbreakable doesn't believe in himself and loses his faith in himself. Signs actually has a priest as the main character, which was just something so familiar to M. Night. His culture and day-to-day experience would influence why his films are dark and deal with death. Growing up, his grandmother would tell him the house was haunted and would nail a chicken head outside to counter a curse put on the house. It was normal to believe in those things in the culture. It just became ghosts and aliens in his films. It is odd because of how cheerful and happy M. Night seems to be in interviews and such, but just because he makes movies about death doesn't mean he can't be cheerful. A thing that tends to pop up in M. Night films that isn't good is his writing. He writes all of his films he directs. He comes up with awesome stories and has made movies with really, really good writing and dialogue, but he has also written really bad dialogue. He tends to have a difficult time balancing between explaining things and talking. He kind of fluctuates. At first, he would explain a lot of what's going on through dialogue, especially in Wide Awake, with many long monologues. Characters just explaining what's happening or how they're feeling instead of just showing us, which is kind of tough to sit through. On the other hand, he does really good with writing sometimes because he looks at at it that the plot should organically come from the characters. He places the characters in a situation, and looking through their perspective will lead to what's happening next, which I think works really well when the stars align and he's not leaning on really long monologues like in Sixth Sense or Unbreakable or Signs. So he gets much better with his dialogue, then kind of backtracks on certain later films, which is kind of weird. That's why I kind of said it fluctuates. He had a hard time at first, then got better, then went back in his way, then he fixes it again. So he's subtle, and other times he's just slapping us in the face with information. A good thing to know is where to start with M. Night. If you haven't watched any of his films before, I would say Unbreakable would be a good first pick. You're not watching his best film, but the next best thing in my opinion. I would save to watch Praying with Anger and Wide Awake for those who are M. Night fans, for those who just want to see him going through his stepping stones. I think if you had to pick only a few to watch, you need to at least watch The Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, and Split. I mean, I think you should watch most of his films, like Science Glass and The Visit are all really good, and even his lesser films like The Village and Lady in the Water, those are even worth giving a check out at least once. Except for The Happening, The Last Airbender, I honestly won't recommend anyone to watch those movies. That's just my opinion, though. There is one last question I would like to answer. Like me, you might be asking yourself, if you have seen all of M. Night's films, how can someone possibly go from making great films like The Sixth Sense or Unbreakable, then make movies like The Happening or The Last Airbender? Movies that are really, really bad. Well, I think I actually uncovered the answer to that in an interview with M. Night. He was giving this speech, I think it was at Drexel. He describes life in two columns. The first column are things that you can control, and the second being things that are out of your control. Knowing what column something lands in is very important in life. M. Night says you shouldn't put effort into things that are in the second column because you can't control it no matter who you are or what you do. You can really drive yourself crazy if you mix up what column it falls in. Well, M. Night got to a point where he got confused on what he had control over and started to doubt whether he had ever had any power to begin with. So once he felt he had lost control over the first column, he started to try to control aspects in both columns. He was trying to control the outcome of his life and his films. You can't control everything. So he tried to work with different people and make different films, but everything he tried failed, and it led him to be unhappy. I believe the time that he speaks of would be around 2006 when he felt he lost his power, because he had the films The Village and Lady in the Water that kind of followed his formula of the films up to that point that were successful, but these two films didn't quite work. So I feel that he attempted to change up his filmmaking style and started to make bigger scale films, and worked with studios and properties he probably wouldn't have beforehand. This is why I think we have The Happening and The Last Airbender and After Earth, especially The Last Airbender, because it just doesn't at all feel like he should have ever made it. It was so out of his style that it was doomed from the beginning. I don't know who thought that that was a good idea. It's just so not M. Night Shyamalan, so I'll never understand how this movie happened. Some people are really good in one department and not in others. You need to know what you're good at and play to those strengths. Not saying you shouldn't try other things, but going from small-scale stories in Philly to an adaptation of an animated series to live action about people who can bend elements and go all across the world might not be the best idea. Maybe start a little smaller. So I think that concludes my crash course on M. Night Shyamalan. Stay tuned for my movie talk discussing all of his films. I'm really trying to figure out how I'm going to do that one, because I really don't want to sit down and talk by myself again like the Cameron movie talk. So I'm in the process of trying to find someone to sit down to talk to. But a new crash course will be coming out next month of February, so stay tuned for that. And then Knock at the Cabin comes out on February 3rd, 2023, so go check it out. I know I'm going to. I'm really excited to see it. I can't wait. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Have a good one.